You're with Julian on the Brown Note and a review of the 6th album from Jack White called No Name, which has generated an enormous buzz. He started giving it away or selling it at gigs in vinyl format about June time, and people were immediately ebullient about how it was a return to the golden era of the early White Stripes and the most garage rock thing that he'd ever done since that era. Obviously Jack White of the White Stripes, and I must admit I found myself feeling the timing of this is really good because everything at the moment seems to be dovetailing into this Oasis reunion, and I immediately thought White Stripes reunion. And I think it's all sort of come together that this album really makes you want Meg White and Jack White, one of the most iconic acts of the early 2000s, to come back. I think that, initially the White Stripes were the peers of the Strokes as the kings of the new indie garage rock scene around the year 2000. But given the Strokes kind of tapered off, even though their second album was fabulous, they tapered off, whereas the White Stripes kept building momentum, I guess, which really hit around, I think, their third album, White Blood Cells, I think their pinnacle. And then over the next few albums, they maintained the velocity, whereas the Strokes kind of tapered off. And I saw them a couple of times on the White Blood Cells tour and on the subsequent Elephant tour, I'm not sure. And when you watch Jack White, one of the most talented musicians of the last 40 years, after the White Stripes, he's on stage with 10 other virtuoso musicians, and they all drown each other out. The songs are lost in the complexity of what everyone's doing, and I'm never going to go to that music. Even though it's probably quite good, it doesn't have that primal, compelling nature of the White Stripes music. And for that reason, Meg White on drums, even live, was the perfect foil for him to just be there with his voice, his songs, his guitar, and when I saw him on piano as well. It was perfect. And all of the other stuff that's been added has become incredibly verbose, over the top level of detail and stuff in the songs, which has detracted from them. So when he came back with this 6th album, the first thing I thought was White Stripes have got to get back together, because this is pretty much a pre-White Blood Cells White Stripes album, which is great. The timing of it is great. If he'd have done this after the Icky Thump, the last White Stripes album, it wouldn't have been as interesting. But given his long hiatus of more than a decade from doing that primal music, it suddenly feels like it's exactly the right time. I believe they will do a tour. I am sure of it. So No Name eventually got released as a proper release album, and boy is it great. It's fantastic. It opens with Old Scratch Blues. It's got this really lyrical sort of guitar lick that opens it before trashing the place. And a little bit of a Dead Leaves vibe, not for the only time on this album. The opening track to White Blood Cells, one of the best things he's ever done. And so it goes often throughout the album with these pummeling sort of Led Zepp riffs, which is typical. And lyrically, it's a fascinating album. It's all over the shop, from these sort of State of the Union addresses about the context of, current affairs and the world as it is, and these sort of more cliched sort of blues style demonic sort of looks at love and being despairing and so on. I'm a motorcycle rolling, another psycho trolling. There's a lot of ground covered in the opening track, which is one of the best on the albums. It brings in a Hammond organ. It sounds like a lot of posturing in a good way, like trying on all of the clothes. It's a very fun album, I found. got a sort of accusatory sort of blues vibe about it. You done me wrong sort of vibe going on. You're going to find out. It's fabulous. And so is the second track, Bless Yourself, is If God is on demand. If God's too busy, I'll bless myself. It's got this Depeche Mode personal Jesus vibe about God and how you relate to God. And even heavier riffing than the first track. And his vocal performances throughout are fantastic. He sounds completely manic. Trust no one is another lyric that comes out. And the energy level here is fabulous. The third track opens with a bass and drum sort of vibe of Is This It from the Strokes, which is fantastic. But then he goes into The Hives, this Swedish band, doing The White Stripes, which is fantastic as well on the very riffy chorus. Got a bit of a teen angst vibe on the lyrics, and almost like Fell in Love with a Girl sort of vibe on the heavy riffing on the chorus as well. Definite highlight, and almost a self-care sort of vibe. Another terrific Led Zepp riff on It's Tough on Rats, if you're asking, and fabulous drums as well at this stage. There's virtually no one personnel-wise on this album, but I think he's got a drummer in for the majority of the tracks. I think he might have drummed on one. And it's got some interesting, very clean guitar picking on it as well. The track is the grooviest on the album. It's got this terrific sort of almost syncopated beat with this do-ding, do-ding, really sort of groove bass track. And another highlight so far is magnificent. Archibald Harold Holmes, the fifth track. It sounds like Ballroom Blitz. Is that the suite? The opening riff is Ballroom Blitz, and that spoken word track from White Blood Cells about Citizen Kane, where he puts on this English posh accent for some reason. I'm going to tear down the institution. Sort of half rapping the verses, acting like some kind of insane doctor, reminding me of the iconic rap album Dr. Octagonologist, which is a fabulous album. He sounds like this demented doctor that should be struck off. Bombing Out, another really short sort of 2.5 minute track. Absolute belter, absolute burner of a track. The lowest fi track recorded here sounds like it's mono. Sounds like it's on a 2-track recorder. The grungiest production. Absolute belter with a wild solo in it, and then probably the closest to Fell in Love with a Girl's riffage. What's the Rumpus? Again, it's like a bit more mid-tempo, almost like a sort of like upper mid-tempo Chili Peppers Californication era track. It's got a great sort of doo-doo-doo bass line like Gigantic by the Pixies. Truth becomes opinion these days. The lyrics are sort of broadened out from this whole bluesy love triangle sort of vibe to actually looking at the world at the moment and it's the fluttering guitar soloing on it's fantastic as well. What's the Rumpus? When will the label dump us? Which I thought was there's a lot of humour in this, I suppose because he owns the record label. Third Man Recordings is his own record label. And, you know, up until that point, every track is an absolute winner. So 7 tracks in is absolutely fantastic. There is some sort of mid-range stuff coming, which is Tonight Was a Long Time Ago. It's a longer track. The opening is very much like Freeze All Right Now, with that sort of beat and that ding, ding, sort of guitar chords going over it. It's the hoariest rocker on the album, I think. But I think a couple of tracks in a row are a little bit too long, and you kind of get where you need to go by 1.5 minutes, and I think this one's like 4.5 minutes. It's still probably as good as one of the better tracks on the last of the Queens of the Stone Age albums, which is probably my least favourite of theirs overall. But it is overlong and a little bit more pedestrian and less exciting and compelling than the previous 7 tracks. Same with Underground as well, more Led Zepp riffing. It's got great moments. It's just, and some really good hooks on it, but I didn't always like the vocal treatment and didn't find it as compelling. And but then it sort of pulls itself back. Number one with the Bullet, track 10. It's got a very sort of ordinary, boring opening for a few seconds, and then just comes in with this massive, dramatic wall of sound. A pretty much like a Queens of the Stone Age track from the turn of the century as well, like almost like something like Feel Good Hit of the Summer. It's got a really pulverizing riff going on, and some great verses and melodies on the verses, and the chorus payoff as well. It flies by its 3 and a bit minute runtime compared to the previous 2 tracks. And Morning at Midnight, some of the best production on the album, quite psychedelic as well. Some great crunchy sort of riffs, and the Hammond organ reappears. I think by track 12, Missionary, which is the second to last track, the style of the album has become a little bit samey. The way that the crunchy riffs come in, and sort of the energy and pace of the tracks as well. But there's, on the chorus, there's this almost like Sex Pistols, Anarchy in the UK era driving riffage going on, which is great. I'm going to grow on you like an apple seed. A lot of the lyrics across the whole album are funny or interesting. But the style, I feel like it's maybe 2 tracks too long. Maybe it would have been a better album to take out a couple of those mid tracks, because when you've got an album where every track for the first 7 tracks is absolutely fantastic, then you kind of notice the mid-tier tracks kind of detract from it. Luckily, the last track, Terminal Arch Enemy Ending, is absolutely a top-tier track on this album. The most White Blood Cells track on the album. I really did hear immediately one of my favourite nonsense lyrics of all time. If you can hear a piano fall, you can hear me walking down the hall. And the softer vocals, a nice change as well. It's got these gentle parts and more gentle drums as well. What's the point in being free if I'm all alone? It's a fantastic closer to the album. It's a very well-timed opportunity to produce this kind of album by Jack White. I think a lot of these opportunities are where you make them, and no one was asking for this. But when they got it, it's like no one was asking for the Oasis reunion. And when it happened, people were like, oh, this is going to be fun. And I think that's the overriding vibe I get from the whole album, is I'm going to listen to it so many times. I really have. Because it's so much fun. And there's not that much in the way of the heaviness from the last of the Queens of the Stone Age album, where I felt like they were trying to make the songs rather than them coming out with this sort of lightning in a bottle excitement. And I really do feel that this album does that. The only minor quibbles are that the final third contains the album's only slightly weaker tracks, which aren't that much weaker. So overall, Jack White, No Name, is definitely in the mix for my albums of the year. I guess by the end of the year, if I've listened to it far more than a couple of these higher scored contenders, it's definitely in with a shout, but it is a fucking brilliant album. So Jack White, No Name, a very easy and nearly more 9 out of 10.